Kia ora, I'm Eve, I work at Arts for Health. Welcome to another art therapy video. Today we're doing an art therapy process based on materials, and we're specifically using tin foil for our material exploration today. So we're using tin foil as our way to make a sculpture. We've got a couple of other materials here, but tin foil is the main one. The idea here is that we're using this to encourage us to focus on the present and focus on what form and shape we're creating in front of ourselves, and then that's going to bring us to focus on ourself a little bit more, do some self-awareness and explore the response that we have to our sculpture that we've made. So it's all about staying in the present and making meaning for ourselves. But the unique thing about today is that we're making a sculpture, so we're focusing a little bit more on the 3D images rather than 2D images. Also, because of the nature of having something 3D sitting in front of us, we can have a little response and a little bit of communication between yourself and the image that you've made, the 3D sculpture that you've made. So that's something that we're going to explore today. So it's all about staying in the present, focusing on the material, and then focusing on our response to that material and that sculpture that we've made. So, materials that we need: tin foil. I've also got a few different pieces of wood here, so we've got some skewers and a little bit of doweling and also some toothpicks. I've also got some natural materials, so some shells, some stones. The idea of those is that they have a weight to them that will balance out the lightness of the foil. And just one other thing that we need is paper and pen, so we can do a little bit of reflecting and responses as we go and at the end. Okay, so what are our steps today? Our very first step is to get into our body and to start focusing on our materials. So touching your page, doing a little bit of breathing, a couple of deep breaths, letting out your carbon dioxide and getting in some new oxygen. And then we're going to lay out a piece of foil and just get in touch with it a little bit. So you might be just pushing the foil around, you might be tapping it, you might be rolling it. Just something initially to get us back in touch with our material, because our first focus is on the material, and that's the way we're going to stay in the present. Our next step is to work with our starters. So we have two starters, and they're two sets of words, two pairs. So the first one is simplicity and complexity. Okay, so things that are simple or things that are complex, lots of things going on, layered, so simplicity and complexity. The next pair is expansion and contraction. So expansion, opening up, contraction, closing in. So those two pairs, they're not supposed to be about what's better or worse or what's right and wrong. They're just two opposing ideas that give us some very broad spaces to explore, and they're going to help us explore the material and ourselves as well. So using those starters, we're just going to start working with the material. So you might start two-dimensional, flat, or you might start to build something three-dimensional. So if you're feeling like, oh my goodness, I don't know what to do first, make something that's simple or complex, or something that's expansive, or something that's contracting. Okay, so those are what our starters are for. They might bring an idea into your mind, or you might just be able to follow them literally to get you going. So there's nothing right or wrong about that. That's what our starters are for. Now the next step is to make a three-dimensional sculpture. So the word sculpture doesn't need to mean anything like special high art that someone else needs to understand. Our sculpture here is just a three-dimensional shape that can sit in front of you. So for our sculpture, the options are to explore a dwelling or a creature. So there might be something that's come up from your starter that's leading you towards a dwelling or some place, or there might be something that's come up from your starter that's leading you towards a creature or something that's living. Or something else might have popped up for you, and definitely follow that thing that's standing out to you at that time. So the idea here is that there's a few options, and you can choose which one stands out to feel right to you at that time. So our next step is to explore what is our response, what does it feel like for us as we're making this form in front of us, as we're making this sculpture in front of us. So it's really cool to be able to notice what is going on for me in my thoughts, in my senses, in my emotions as I'm making this thing in front of me. You might notice that you're focusing on something about the material, something about the tin foil. You might notice something about the sound or the feeling of it. You might remember something popping into your head. So we're just noticing what's going on for me, because you are a very important part of the relationship between yourself and your art. Another part of noticing what's going on for us is giving ourselves permission to notice what's being challenging and what's feeling good, what's feeling supportive for you. So notice as you go, as you're making your sculpture in front of you, what feels like a challenge to me right now, and just notice that, and it doesn't need to change or get fixed. And also notice what feels good to me, what feels strong, what are my resources here, what do I feel like is supporting me, what's useful to me here, and just notice those things. So here we're trying to stay in the present and just notice what's happening for us and what's happening with the artwork. Now we're going to lean into those supports a little bit, so we're going to give ourselves permission as part of our next step to explore a little bit more about what's supportive for us. So see if you can develop some of those things that stand out as supports. Now I'm sure you can guess why this would be useful. We want to increase the supports that we have in our lives. It doesn't mean that we're pushing or being in denial of our challenges. It means that we're building up the things that support us and give us resources and energy. Now we're on to our last phase here. The last step is all about communication and the message between you and your artwork. So the invitation for the last step is to create some sort of communication tool from the artwork to yourself. So we can do this literally by adding elements to our artwork that represent and explore literal communication, or you might choose to do a little bit less literal, a bit more abstract, and maybe write down what you think is happening and make some notes as you go, or towards the end make some notes on a piece of paper nearby as to what you think the artwork is communicating to you. Now our very final step is also writing down what am I communicating back to the artwork. You might be writing down on a piece of paper what you see, what you feel, what's happening in your mind and your emotions at that time, and you might turn those into some sentences or phrases that you are saying to the artwork and the artwork is saying to you. So there's a two-way communication here, and none of it is right or wrong. We're just working on our relationship with our own piece of art. As always, only do the steps that you feel are helpful to you. Okay, so I will do my process, you can see that, and we'll check in afterwards. Okay, so I have finished my image. You can see it here. This is my sculpture. You can see that there's quite a lot of focus on different hands. I've wrapped up some skewers in tinfoil. There's some structural support in there from them, and then also a focus on some different rocks. So I'm sure it's a little bit hard to see just because of the tinfoil being so reflective, but here it is. And then on the inside we've got more like the dwelling side, so this is kind of like a whole structure, and then in here is the dwelling place, so that would be where someone would live or dwell, and here's where my message is. So I've written down the communication that I'm getting from the image, and that's poking into my shell in there. So that's less of a structural part, that's just more like a message, a communication device with the shell. So I started off working with the material, and you would have seen that quite early on I got it sort of interacting with my hands in an interesting way. So I just went with that. I knew that I was getting in touch with it, and I felt like that was me getting the material and my senses going, and there was a lot of contracting of my hands and a little bit of expanding, looking at what's it like to put on and off some foil. So that was just me playing and exploring. I hadn't pre-planned that, as always. I explored simplicity a little bit as well. I felt like the rolling was a simplicity kind of idea, a simple way of working with the material, and all the crinkles just spoke to me of complexity straight away. Then as I built the form, there was a bit more complexity that came in as well. As soon as I started to make multiple hands, I could tell that that was something that I wanted to keep doing to build up some sort of shape, but I also knew that in terms of the weight of the material, I wanted to spend a little bit of time focusing on the rocks that I had as well. So the tinfoil and the rocks both kind of working together a little bit there to have some balance. And I use the skewers as well for some strength. So combining a few different types of materials, I was really focused on that kind of structural element, and then also just what does it mean with this metaphor of hands opening and closing. So that's something that was in my head as I was going. Another thing that I spent some time focusing on as I was making it was the balance and the kind of heavy and light elements. So there's a feeling that it's quite frail, and I really did notice that there's a very lightness, a flimsiness, a sort of crinkly paper just because of the nature of the foil. And I also balanced that in my mind with the feeling of the weight of the rocks. So there was a kind of balancing that was going on, and I would say maybe a little bit of worry or concern or a bit of a challenge about how the material was light and maybe it didn't do exactly what I wanted it to do. But I kind of leaned into that and just went with the frailty of it, and that's why it's all kind of balancing a little bit here. But at the same time, it feels very comforting and like there's some capacity for holding and support. So that's a very interesting balance for me, that this might be a comforting place for some little tinfoil person to live in, and there's a balance between the crinkly, frail nature and the rocks that are in there that they're holding. So those rocks link to things in my life where it feels like there's some resource when I hold a stone in my hand and gives me sort of peace and weight and grounding. And that balances with the reaching upward nature of the whole thing as it kind of reaches to the sky a little bit. So there's a bit of grounding and there's a little bit of optimism, and they're balancing each other. And I quite like that. That's something that I'd like to explore a little bit more. So I noticed the sounds, I definitely noticed the shiny materials, I got really in contact with it. I noticed the supports of the weights of the rocks and how the foil felt really good in my hand. So those were sort of supports, and as I said, some challenges were about the balancing and the kind of risk and precariousness of putting it all together. So those are things that I noticed as I went. Some of the messages and the ideas that I got from the artwork when I explored my own relationship with it were all about how worries and fears aren't all on one person, that we have supports around us, and that we can do things when we put ourselves together. So when we use two hands, or when we borrow someone else's hands, when we sort of put our community together, we can build something real and strong that is lasting and that isn't so precarious. So my message that I got from my shell here, we can do it together. Build a real castle, a real deep, balanced, supportive life, stuck to a rock, reaching up, open and breathing and full of energy. It was quite interesting the way that the material itself could speak so strongly and have such strong ideas coming through. So I hope you give that a go, and then you can explore something about materials like tinfoil or rocks or skewers, and as you make some sort of sculpture you can get a little message from it. So thank you for watching, and watch our next video, and ka kite anō.